They lied to you when they said power comes from kindness. The world loves to repeat that being just, correct, and pure is enough to earn respect, but the reality is quite different. Machiavelli already warned, politics must be guided by reality, not ideals. And reality is cruel. The end justifies the means. You may believe that being loved is enough, but sooner or later, you discover that it's better to be feared than loved, as long as you're never hated. The controversy is simple. What you call virtue is often the weakness others use against you. While you strive to appear perfect, someone, silently, has already noticed the innocent gesture that betrays your insecurity. The appearance of virtue may deceive for a time, but it never deceives forever. Real power lies not in smiling at everyone, but in using force deliberately, adapting to the invisible game of human nature. And it is precisely here that the dark secret lies. There are details, silences, and habits that reveal more about you than any words. Few realize it, and even fewer have the courage to face it head-on. If you stay with me until the end, you will discover what should never have been revealed. Because once you see the truth, there is no going back. The innocent gesture that reveals your weakness. Have you ever noticed how, sometimes, it's not the words that reveal who you are, but the small gesture that slips out unintentionally? A simple adjustment of hands, a flick of your hair, a glance that darts away too quickly. All of these can betray insecurity before you even open your mouth. Machiavelli warned that politics is guided by reality, not ideals. And the reality is that the body speaks louder than prepared speeches. In the field of leadership, for example, someone who looks away when asked a simple question conveys more doubt than any poorly formulated answer. That's why great strategists have always observed not only what was said, but how it was said. After all, if the end justifies the means, you must learn to control the means by which you expose yourself. A shaky hand in a handshake can cost you a contract, a meeting, or even a position. Better to be feared than loved? Perhaps. But never let small signs make you underestimated. Consider the example of an inexperienced salesperson. They may have memorized all the persuasion techniques, studied sales scripts, and even prepared a flawless smile. But all it takes is an innocent gesture, like drumming their fingers on the table while waiting for a response, for the customer to sense their anxiety. The appearance of virtue in these cases fades before a cold reading of human nature. Because people, even without formal training, carry a sharp intuition for picking up on other people's insecurities. This is where the calculated use of force comes in. It's not about forcing an artificial posture, but about training the body to express calm even when your heart is racing. Want to practice? Try observing politicians in debates or executives in interviews. Notice who remains still, firm, and who betrays weakness with involuntary gestures. This exercise opens your eyes to notice in yourself what previously went unnoticed. The curious thing is that throughout history, kings and generals knew that losing control of a single gesture could be more dangerous than losing 100 soldiers. Therefore, they maintained loyal armies of their own, but also trained themselves to never reveal weakness to the enemy. Virtue and fortune went hand in hand. It took skill to control one's body and the luck of having allies attentive to every detail. If you think this is an exaggeration, just think of job interviews. The recruiter often makes a decision in the first few minutes, observing how you sit, whether you cross your arms, or whether you remain relaxed. Decisions based on real human nature are like this: quick, instinctive, and rarely conscious. And while you think you're protected by words, it's in the innocent gesture that the sentence lies. It is precisely at this point that the bridge to another, even more subtle power emerges. Silence. The silence that reveals more than words. Some believe that silence is merely the absence of sound, but in truth, it is a powerful weapon, often more lethal than any speech. Machiavelli taught that in politics guided by reality, not ideals, even what is unsaid can be calculated. When someone remains silent in the face of an accusation, that emptiness can sound like a confession. When silence is presented with an opportunity, it can appear arrogant or disinterested. And when silence is used consciously, it can generate respect and even fear. The end justifies the means. If remaining silent forces the other to speak more than they should, then silence becomes a strategic ally. It's no coincidence that judges, leaders, and negotiators use long pauses. They know that it is often better to be feared than loved, and silence builds this aura of invisible power. The curious thing is that everyone fears emptiness, and whoever endures silence controls the scene. Think of a business meeting. Everyone discusses solutions, points out flaws, talks non-stop. Suddenly, someone decides to say nothing, just observes, gauging every reaction. This person, without raising their voice, commands more attention than those who strive to appear competent. It's the appearance of virtue at its most sophisticated, letting the other person wallow in their own excess. The calculated use of force, in this case, doesn't require shouting, but patience. In political debates, for example, those who master silence have an advantage. It makes their opponent nervous, forcing them to fill the space and thus make mistakes. Silence, used well, is like a loyal army of its own. It doesn't need to be called upon constantly, but when it appears, it changes the course of the battle. Decisions based on real human nature prove that most people can't bear the weight of silence. Those who endure dominate. Have you ever tried applying this in your personal life? Instead of justifying yourself in the face of criticism, try taking a deep breath and simply looking the person in the eye. Silence is more disconcerting than 1,000 defensive words. Constant adaptability is key. At times, silence can be a weakness, but used intentionally, it becomes both a shield and a sword. Consider couples in a fight. Those who talk non-stop tend to wear themselves out faster, while those who wait silently create ground to turn the tables. Virtue and fortune appear here as a pair. Virtue to control oneself, fortune to make the other surrender to excess. Silence, after all, is not passivity, it is strategy. And the most interesting thing, the more you learn to use it, the more you realize that it's not just sounds that reveal truths, but also the mistakes that repeat themselves like an invisible echo. The truth hidden in the mistakes you repeat, few people realize, but repeated mistakes are not mere accidents. They are disguised messages, almost confessions of the unconscious. The person who consistently chooses toxic partners, who spends beyond their means, or who misses out on good job opportunities is actually revealing a much deeper pattern. Machiavelli would remind us that decisions based on true human nature are never the result of naivete. There is always calculation, even if unconscious. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that mistakes are mirrors of what has not yet been mastered. The end justifies the means, and in this case, the means is repetition until the lesson is learned. When someone insists on stumbling over the same point, they are shouting to the world where they are vulnerable. Better to be feared than loved, perhaps. But when one does not correct one's own patterns, neither fear nor love sustain respect. Consider the case of someone who always loses money the same way. A novice investor buys stocks on impulse, loses, promises never to do it again, but months later repeats the same thing. The truth is that the mistake exposes not a lack of knowledge, but insecurity masked by boldness. The appearance of virtue may be deceiving for a time, that air of confidence in meetings, the technical words, but when the market falls, the same gestures betray anxiety. The calculated use of force here would be simple. Stop, analyze, and establish discipline before risking again. Books like the Zurich Axioms or even the chapters of The Prince themselves show how self-control is worth more than any external formula. Repeating mistakes is like persisting in battles without your own loyal armies. Sooner or later, you are crushed. Victory only comes when repetition is broken by awareness. The fascinating thing is that repetition always has one purpose: to teach. Virtue and fortune only align when a person accepts to face head-on the shadow that insists on appearing in their mistakes. Constant adaptability is the only way out, because no pattern is broken without a change of attitude. Want a simple exercise? Write down for 30 days every moment you feel like you've fallen into the same old hole. At the end, read it as if you were analyzing someone else's life. You'll see that the mistakes are almost predictable. This practice reveals more about you than hours of excuses. And as you realize this, you begin to realize something even more uncomfortable. The social mask, which you so often believed protected you, may be the very thing that exposes what you try hardest to hide. The social mask that exposes you without realizing it. Have you ever noticed how the mask we wear to appear strong, confident, or pleasant often turns into a distorted mirror that reveals the opposite? Someone who insists on displaying exaggerated joy may be hiding sadness. Those who display excessive power likely fear being seen as fragile. Machiavelli would say that the appearance of virtue is useful but dangerous when it doesn't match reality. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that no one sustains a role that isn't theirs for long. The end justifies the means, but if the means is a poorly constructed mask, the end can be ruin. It's better to be feared than loved when the image you project inspires true respect. Worse is to try to be loved at any cost and end up hated for exaggerating. The mask, ironically, doesn't hide, it exposes. Take social media as an example. How many people seem to live perfect lives, but it only takes a few minutes of live conversation to discern the difference between the stage and the backstage. The calculated use of force in these cases lies in knowing how to balance public image with private truth without creating an impossible farce. A politician, for example, who flaunts too much virtue may fall at the first scandal, while one who demonstrates controlled human flaws gains more trust. Society respects those who recognize limits because they ring true. Loyal, self-made armies in this sense are not just soldiers, but people who know your true face and still choose to remain by your side. The social mask may win applause but never loyalty. And loyalty is the most expensive currency in any power struggle. Virtue and fortune come into play when a person learns to adjust their mask without losing their essence. Constant adaptability means using the mask as a tool, not a prison. Want to practice? Try showing vulnerability in small doses without sacrificing your firmness. For example, in a meeting, admit you don't know something, but immediately propose an action to find the answer. This humanizes without weakening. Decisions based on true human nature always detect when someone is pretending to be something they are not, and no amount of acting can last long enough to hide the truth. The more you try to stifle who you are, the more insecurity escapes in the smallest details. And it is precisely in these details that the next point lies, that small, almost imperceptible gesture that betrays your insecurity before you even realize it. The smallest detail that reveals your insecurity. Interestingly, it's not the major mistake that betrays vulnerability, but the smallest, almost invisible detail that speaks loudest. A pause too long before responding, a voice that falters at a crucial moment, or even the simple, unnoticed movement of the pen. Machiavelli reminded us that politics should be guided by reality, not ideals, and reality is harsh. people pay less attention to discourse than to the signals hidden between the lines. The end justifies the means, but if the means is the poorly controlled detail, the end can be lost. Better to be feared than loved gains strength here. No one respects someone who seems insecure at moments when they should be firm. The detail is treacherous because it's unrehearsed. It springs from deep within, from what hasn't yet been mastered. It's like a window that opens unintentionally and lets secrets slip out. Imagine a candidate in a job interview. They've prepared for days, revised their answers, rehearsed every sentence. But by crossing their legs and bouncing their foot insistently, they reveal anxiety. This tiny detail can weigh more heavily than all the credentials on their resume. The appearance of virtue dissolves before the examiner's instinctive reading. The calculated use of force, in this case, requires self-awareness, recording yourself speaking, observing repeated gestures, practicing until your body conveys what your mind desires. Leaders who master this field know that loyal armies of their own won't follow those who hesitate in public. Respect is lost in seconds when insecurity sets in. Want to practice? Go to a cafe and discreetly observe people speaking. Notice who seems confident and who gives themselves away in the details. This exercise is a silent lesson in power. Virtue and fortune unite when a person learns to transform details into allies, not enemies. Constant adaptability is training the eye to perceive the signs within oneself before the world does. Decisions based on true human nature always capture the detail because the human mind is programmed to distrust anything that is out of place. Details can destroy a negotiation, but they can also build trust. The firm handshake, the sustained eye contact, the simple gesture of listening without interrupting. These are details that add rather than subtract. Yet even the most careful discover that there is something impossible to hide forever, because behind the gesture and the detail, there is a gaze. And this gaze, whether fixed or fleeting, always reveals hidden intentions that no mask can conceal. The look that reveals hidden intentions. The eyes are messengers of the soul, and no disguise can silence them completely. A leader can master the tone of their voice, control their gestures, and even adjust every detail of their body. But when their gaze wavers, the entire theater collapses. Machiavelli reminded us that decisions based on real human nature always consider what is observed more than what is heard. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that the gaze is the purest confession. The end justifies the means, but if the means is a look of fear or submission, the end is weakness. Better to be feared than loved, and nothing arouses more fear than a firm, direct gaze that does not shy away even in the face of conflict. It is in this silent gaze that authority is built or lost. Consider high-level negotiations. When an executive looks directly into your eyes and maintains steady contact, they convey confidence even in silence. However, someone who constantly looks away, checks their phone, or pretends to be busy with paperwork makes it clear they're trying to escape. The appearance of virtue is sustained not only by the words chosen, but also by the way the gaze confirms or contradicts the speech. The calculated use of force here is to direct the gaze like a sword, firm when you need to intimidate, soft when you want to approach, neutral when you want to observe without being noticed. Leaders who command loyal armies of their own know that soldiers don't just follow orders, they follow gazes that inspire confidence. Want to practice? In simple conversations, hold your gaze 2 seconds longer than you normally would. You'll see how this changes the energy of the interaction and puts you in control. Virtue and fortune intertwine when the gaze is used masterfully. Constant adaptability means adjusting the intensity of the gaze to the environment. At work, firmness. At home, warmth. In conflict, vigilance. Decisions based on real human nature prove that everyone seeks coherence between what is said and what is seen. The gaze betrays hidden intentions because it doesn't lie. The body may, but the eyes always escape. Want a practical example? Look at poker players. They wear sunglasses because they know their eyes betray emotions, fear, or euphoria. This same principle applies to everyday life. Whoever controls their gaze controls the narrative. But even with all the practice, some public habits become even more dangerous because they destroy respect in a matter of seconds without giving a chance to defend themselves. The public habit that destroys respect in seconds. Respect is built with effort and time, but it can be destroyed in seconds by a poorly controlled public habit. Talking too much about oneself, constantly interrupting, complaining excessively, or even that seemingly harmless habit of checking one's phone while someone else is talking, all of these undermine authority. Machiavelli would point out that politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that it is not grand speeches that sustain power, but small behaviors visible to the attentive eye. The end justifies the means, but if the means are habits that expose carelessness, the end is a loss of credibility. Better to be feared than loved finds a clear example here. No one fears, respects, or follows someone who betrays themselves in public. Public habit acts like an open window. It only takes an instant for everyone to see what should remain hidden. Think of a boss who is always late to meetings but demands punctuality from others. This public habit destroys respect faster than any technical flaw. The appearance of virtue fades when example doesn't match words. The calculated use of force requires discipline, correcting simple habits that, when seen by others, convey inconsistency. It's like a loyal army. A commander who gives orders but appears sloppy doesn't inspire trust, but rather inspires revolt. Want to practice? Choose a small but consistent habit that could be eroding your image. It could be chewing with your mouth open, using bad language, or interrupting conversations. Record yourself or ask someone you trust to observe and write it down. External perception almost always reveals what you don't perceive in yourself, and this awareness is worth more than any excuse. Virtue and fortune manifest when someone transforms public habit into a tool to reinforce their own authority. Constant adaptability means eliminating behaviors that weaken and cultivating gestures that strengthen. Decisions based on true human nature prove that people don't analyze you logically, but with fleeting impressions. If public habit exposes you poorly, your reputation declines. But if public habit reinforces respect, such as remaining silent after a firm speech, greeting with a regal presence, or never being late, your authority grows without additional effort. Ultimately, every habit is a visible signature, a trace left in the perception of others. And the most intriguing thing is that no matter how much someone tries to hide weaknesses, there are always questions capable of turning the tables, revealing intentions and dismantling masks. The secret of game-changing questions. Those who master the questions control the direction of the conversation. While most worry about having ready-made answers, strategists understand that true power lies in knowing what to ask. Machiavelli taught that decisions based on real human nature rely less on what you say and more on what you can extract from the other person. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that well-directed curiosity is a sharper weapon than any argument. The end justifies the means, and the means here is to ask questions that guide the interlocutor's mind without them realizing it. Better to be feared than loved. Perhaps, but those who ask precisely arouse both respect and fascination. A simple question like, "What did you mean by that?" can disarm a manipulator, reveal hidden intentions, and turn the tide in seconds. Here's a practical example. In a job interview, instead of simply answering, a candidate who asks, "How does this company measure success for this role?" demonstrates strategic intelligence. They don't just answer, they invert the analysis, forcing the interviewer to expose themselves. The appearance of virtue proves even more valuable when the questions create the feeling that you're not just playing the game, but controlling the board. The calculated use of force, in this case, is to put the other person in a position to reveal themselves without having to show off. It's like in a battle, loyal, self-contained armies win not only through brute force, but through the ability to disorient the enemy. Questions have this effect. Want to practice? In a casual conversation, exchange a statement for a question. Instead of saying, "I think this is risky," ask, "Have you thought about the consequences if this goes wrong?" The impact is immediate. Virtue and fortune go hand in hand when one understands that the right questions not only expose others, but also build silent authority. Constant adaptability means varying between open-ended questions, which stimulate reflection, and closed-ended questions, which demand definition. Decisions based on true human nature prove that few can resist the urge to answer. The secret lies in asking questions not to fill silence, but to guide reasoning. Leaders, negotiators, teachers, all who master this resource transform dialogues into tools of influence. But there's a delicate point. If questions become disguised submission, the strategy is lost. There's an invisible line between trust and submission, and those who don't recognize this line risk exchanging power for dependence. The invisible line between trust and submission. Trust is the foundation of any solid relationship, but there's a fine line that, when crossed, turns trust into submission. The problem is that this boundary is nearly invisible, and many only realize it when they've already lost their balance. Machiavelli would point out that politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that trust is necessary, but submission is dangerous. The end justifies the means. But if the means is the loss of one's own autonomy, the end will always be weakness. Better to be feared than loved applies here. When trust turns into blind obedience, the other party stops respecting and begins to exploit. How many leaders have fallen because they confused loyalty with servitude? Trust sustains alliances, submission destroys reputations. And the thing is, those who submit rarely realize how much they're giving up until it's too late. Consider the workplace. An employee who trusts their boss follows orders, but also questions them when they notice mistakes. One who submits never questions, even knowing there's a mistake. The appearance of virtue can mask this difference for a time. The submissive person appears dedicated, loyal, even exemplary, but in practice, the calculated use of force requires distinguishing between active trust and passive obedience. Leaders who maintain loyal armies of their own know they don't need submissives, but allies. Trust builds bridges, while submission creates chains. Want to practice? Observe your own relationships. Do you feel you can say no without fear? If the answer is no, perhaps trust has already turned into submission. This simple exercise reveals how deeply you hold on to power, or whether you've already surrendered it without realizing it. Virtue and fortune emerge in balance, trusting enough to create bonds, but maintaining enough autonomy to avoid becoming hostage. Constant adaptability means adjusting the level of surrender according to the context. Trusting friends, but not negating yourself. Trusting leaders, but not abandoning critical thinking. Decisions based on true human nature show that people test limits. If you never set up barriers, the other person will always push harder. The invisible boundary between trust and submission is, therefore, a question of identity. Those who don't know who they are will always be used by those who know what they want. And the more you try to hide your lack of firmness, the more the shadow appears. exposing precisely what you wanted to hide, the shadow that always appears when you try to hide. No matter how hard one tries to disguise it, the shadow always finds a way to emerge. That anger you swear you've controlled, the fear you've conquered, or the insecurity you believe you've buried, all of this returns at the most unexpected moments. Machiavelli knew that politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires facing one's own darkness head-on. The end justifies the means, but if the means is constant repression, the end will be an inevitable explosion. Better to be feared than loved finds its intimate version here. Better to face your shadow and learn to master it than to feign purity and be unmasked at the wrong moment. The shadow is not an enemy, it is a sign. It appears precisely when you try to hide it, like someone knocking on the door, demanding attention. And to ignore it is to empower what should be integrated. A simple example, someone who represses insecurity can become excessively arrogant, always trying to prove their worth. This excess doesn't deceive for long, because the appearance of virtue turns into a caricature. The calculated use of force in this case is to recognize the shadow before it reveals itself in public. Leaders who have loyal armies of their own don't earn respect by denying their flaws, but by showing they know how to deal with them. Virtue is the courage to face one's own wounds. Fortune is finding in this process allies who respect authenticity. Want to practice? When you feel irritation or fear, instead of denying it, note what's happening. Ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to show me? This simple practice transforms the shadow into a teacher, because deep down, hiding only strengthens what you'd like to eliminate. Constant adaptability means learning to live with the shadow without being dominated by it. Decisions based on true human nature prove that everyone has blind spots, but only some have the courage to illuminate them. The shadow appears when you try to hide it because the mind can't bear lying to itself for long. It's like trying to hide a river underground. Sooner or later, it finds a fissure to gush out. True power lies not in denying the shadow, but in integrating it, making it part of who you are. Machiavelli would have smiled at this idea because he knew that the man who knows himself is harder to manipulate. And here we come to a delicate point. If all this is true, what remains is to look at the dark secret that should never be revealed, but that can completely change the way you see power and yourself. Now that you've seen every detail that reveals your weakness, the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you continue repeating the same mistakes, wearing fragile masks and sustaining habits that destroy respect in seconds? Or will you transform all this into strategy, using silence, a clear gaze, and the right questions as invisible weapons? Machiavelli once said that politics is guided by reality, not ideals. And the reality is clear. Those who lack self-control end up dominated by others. The end justifies the means, and in this case, the means is deciding whether to remain submissive to your own shadow or embrace it to earn true respect. Better to be feared than loved, perhaps, but above all, it's better to be respected than forgotten. And I challenge you, which of these points have you recognized in yourself? What habit or gesture will you eliminate starting today? If something here touched your soul, write in the comments. Sometimes the first step to change is admitting out loud what was already hidden. And if you want to continue learning secrets like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the game is just beginning.